Selective attention is the skill through which a person, or technically any being that can attend, focuses on one input or one task while ignoring other stimuli that are also present. So this would be the case of you paying attention to my voice and not maybe the sound of music, or paying attention to a cup that's on the table and not everything else that's on the table, or in pretty much any situation where you're focused on only one thing, you are employing selective attention. One of the earliest ways in which we studied selective attention in cognitive psychology is through studies referred to as dichotic listening paradigms or dichotic listening studies. And these were experiments in which two different audio streams are played to each ear. Well, sorry about that. Two audio streams are played, one to each ear. So you have one set of sounds coming in one ear and another set of sounds coming into the other ear. And both of these are simultaneous. Participants are then told to only pay attention to one of these streams. So imagine you're listening to a soap opera in your right ear and you're listening to a sports commentator in your left ear. So participants are instructed to pay attention to one of those streams. That stream is oftentimes called the attended channel, the one you're paying attention to. And then they're meant to ignore the unintended channel or not pay attention to it. Now, if those were the only instructions you were given, it would be actually pretty hard for a person not to keep switching their attention back and forth, paying attention to one for a little while and then moving over to the other, and so on and so forth. So in order to keep a person's focus on only one channel and prevent it from bouncing back and forth, they're also told to shadow the intended channel. And what this means is that they need to repeat back or parrot all of the words that they're hearing. So let's say you're hearing the sports commentator, and so as you're listening to the sports commentator, you just keep repeating everything that they're saying. And either you already know that humans are really good at this because you have siblings and you've done this to each other to annoy each other when you were younger, or if you don't, you can either watch television for a little while or listen to the radio, and within about a minute, you'll be pretty good at being able to say pretty much every single word that you're hearing. Studies also show that pretty much that accuracy rate is about 100% within a minute or two. What do these tasks tell us? Like I mentioned, accuracy approaches 100% really, really fast, and people are able to respond to the semantic content, meaning the meaning of the words, for the attended channel. So if you were paying attention to the sports announcer, you would be able to then, if I asked you later, tell me about what the sports announcer was saying. Or if you were paying attention to the soap opera, you would be able to tell me about what was said in the soap opera. But for the unintended channel, one can rarely talk about the semantic content. Meaning, if you were paying attention to the sports commentator, you would not be able to tell me really anything about what was said about the soap opera, and vice versa. If you were paying attention to the soap opera, you wouldn't really be able to tell me anything about what the sports commentator was talking about. Some studies have even shown that you can play other languages that have been edited or modified to sound like the native language of the participant, and most people can't even tell. It can even be pure gibberish. As long as it has been doctored to make it sound like their native language, most people can't tell when that transition happens of going from regular speech into just gibberish. We are, however, not completely oblivious to what is presented in the unattended channel. We're able to report basically the physical qualities of whoever is speaking or what types of sounds they are. So we can easily report the gender of the speaker, for example, at least stereotypical gendered speakers, and you can oftentimes note about the tone of voice, whether it sounded harsh or angry or soft or something like this, and just the volume also. Was someone screaming or was someone whispering? Those types of content are actually pretty easy to recognize, even when you're not paying attention to it, as in it's the unattended channel, and so you're able to respond to questions about those types of things. But as soon as you ask what was said, it is pretty murky at best. There are a few special exceptions to this. So if your name is played on the unattended channel, chances are you will hear that name. Not every single time, but it will happen often. This is exactly the same phenomena that is referred to oftentimes as the cocktail party effect, and that is just you can be at a bar or at a party and someone across the room will say your name, even if they're not actually talking to you or about you, and our attention immediately goes to wherever that name was uttered, because we're just ultimately hyper attuned to our own names. And as we'll talk about later, that's pretty much just because we hear our name all the time, and so the detectors for our name are very highly primed. This extends to certain other things with which we are either relatively personally involved with, or we have recently been talking about and it meant something again to us. So if you have one favorite restaurant and you have been going to this favorite restaurant for the last 25 years and its name is just iconic, chances are if you hear someone mention it, you'll be like, yep, okay, I'm on to that right now. And it's just another concept of one of those things that is very highly primed, and so we're very attuned to them. So those types of things we will pick up even in that unattended channel. But for the most part, we are not able to talk about any of the semantic content in that channel itself, while we can do it pretty much flawlessly for the attended channel. Now, there's a large body of empirical evidence to support that not only does this happen in multiple auditory situations, but it happens in visual situations as well. So one of the most famous of these, of course, I'm ruining this for you now if you have not seen it, but this is a video of 6 people who are bouncing basketballs back and forth. So I believe there are 2 basketballs and there are 2 sets of people. So 3 of these people are wearing black shirts and 3 of these people are wearing white shirts. And all of the black shirt people are passing the ball back and forth to the black shirt people, and the white shirt people are doing the same for just the white shirt people. And they're all kind of moving around each other, and they're all passing the ball back and forth, either by bouncing it or just tossing it to each other. And they catch it and keep going and do this over and over. And your task when you're exposed to this video is to count the number of passes that one of the 2 teams makes. So your goal is to focus on, like I am now paying attention, let's say, to all the 3 who are wearing black shirts, and when one passes to the other, I'm like, okay, 1, and then they pass again 2, and pass again 3, so on and so forth. And so you're doing this, and halfway through this video, a person wearing a gorilla suit will walk up through the crowd, stop in the middle, face the camera, beat on their chest, turn around, and walk away. And the thing that is so crazy, I mean, for you now, like I said, I've ruined this because we're talking about it. You'll probably register the gorilla right away. And you will now probably be shocked at how someone could not see that gorilla, or the human gorilla person. And the truth is, most people actually, when they watch this for the first time, will not see it. So I've attached the video link here. Of course, this is a video, so you can't click on it. So you'll have to old school just type this out in your browser if that's your jam. Or you can probably just go into YouTube and type attention video gorilla basketball or something like this, because search engines work like this. And since many people are stuck at home, and you chances are have people who you are stuck at home with, I highly recommend not telling them what is going to happen, just playing this video and have them follow the instructions. And then at the end, be like, yo, did you see that gorilla? And just watch their expressions. It is pretty remarkable the amount of people who will not register that that gorilla walks through. Well, the human in a gorilla suit. But it just again goes to show you that we're paying attention to one thing, the basketball passes, and in doing so, we become oblivious to other matters inside that video input. This is analogous to the auditory streams to each ear, where instead of sounds to each ear, our visual attention is hyper-focused on basketball passes and not on other things that might also be present in the situation. Another way of thinking about this is it would be unlikely if you were counting one team's basketball passes that you would automatically or spontaneously know how many passes the other team made as well. So a lot of early theories proposed that there was some type of perceptual filter. So this is something that we had in our perceptual or cognitive system that allowed us to differentiate between desired and undesired stimuli and impose a block on undesired stimuli. And it turns out that there's actually quite a significant body of research that supports this idea, that our system is able to tune out stimuli that are irrelevant to us and not devote very much processing to them, and allow stimuli that are relevant to us to pass relatively unmolested through the early parts of the perceptual system. One other interesting finding that has come up through this literature is that this filter is very stimulus specific. This just means that while you can become attuned and keep something out, as soon as that stimulus changes a little bit, all of a sudden we become aware of it once again. So let's say there was a beeping sound or a tone that you find irritating, and after a while you just don't pay attention to it. If the frequency of that tone changes a little bit, chances are you will all of a sudden again start paying attention to that sound. And this is because the filter was originally suited towards that one particular frequency, and now that that's changed, the filter needs to relearn or become calibrated once more that this is an additional irrelevant stimulus. And because, as it says on the slide, nothing is quite straightforward in the brain, there is also another body of literature that supports the idea that stimulus that is desired or wanted, stimulus that we would like to pay attention to, it actually receives a bonus to its levels of activation, which is very similar to how we were talking about priming, where certain types of feature detectors can have their activation thresholds raised, and thus they're more sensitive to what is presented to them. In this way, it is not just filtering out of unwanted stimuli or trying to block them from entering, but we're able to, of the ones that enter, give priority to certain stimuli over others. And these are two different ways in which we can modulate what things we're paying attention to. So thinking back to the gorilla video, either we're able to somehow block out the gorilla, right, with some type of filter, or we're able to give the basketball passing back and forth additional activation, so we become very sensitive to just that basketball, and we're sort of middling attention or attending to everything else. And of course, what we're going to spend a bunch of time in this lecture talking about is which way is it that causes us to miss the gorilla, and what is it about these two systems in our perception that allows us to listen to one audio stream and hear nothing of the other. Well, not nothing, but none of the content of the other. So before getting into that too far, we'll start talking about something called inattentional blindness, and this refers to situations in which a perceiver appears to, quite literally, not see a stimulus immediately in front of their eyes. So this would apply to the gorilla that literally stands in the middle of the screen and beats their chest. And so it's thought that this is due to the perceiver, the person who's looking, attending to other stimuli, right, like the basketball, and not expecting a target. Like no one, when they starts the video, unless of course you have a person like me who's ruined it for you, no one is expecting that gorilla to walk through. And so it's just not something you're paying attention to. And this has some pretty crazy empirical demonstrations, which we'll talk about on the next slide, and then some really serious real-world consequences, which we'll talk about in 2 slides. So the first real demonstration of inattentional blindness came by Mark and Rock in 1998. This is a book actually, and I have not been able to find the original paper in which this was published, though I will try and dig it up once the library sends me the book. So the way this works is participants are sitting in front of a computer screen, and they're told to fixate on a central dot. So there's a little dot in the middle of the screen, and they're told to keep their eyes on that dot, so they keep their focus on it. Now, in different parts of the screen, a cross will appear, a vertical plus sign. It could be in the top left, top right, bottom left, kind of like this. And their goal is to keep their eyes focused on that central dot, but using their peripheral vision, determine if the horizontal line is longer or if the vertical line is longer. They have 2 buttons, and they push one if the horizontal is longer and one if the vertical is longer. So imagine you're sitting there, you're focused on this little dot, this little cross sign blinks at a different time, it just sort of pops up and then disappears, and you're like, okay, I think the vertical line was longer, push one button. Right? Then you go to the next trial. Same thing happens, but it's just in a different place on the screen. Keeping your eyes focused on that central dot, click for one of the 2 options. Next trial starts, we're on the 3rd trial, same thing happens. Keep your eye focused on that dot,
another little cross appears somewhere, you make your determination about which of the two lines that make up the cross was longer. Fourth trial happens, same type of thing, cross shows up, you decide one way or another. And then right after the fourth trial, participants are asked, did you see the shape that was in place of the fixation spot when the cross appeared? And most people will not. And so it's not a trick that they're asking. They literally, for the same time that they show that cross, they present either a triangle, a square, or a circle in place of that central dot. And not like a tiny little, I mean, it's not huge either, but like it would be hard to miss with regular vision or normal corrected vision of any kind. And they find that 90% of people don't even notice anything was strange with the trial, let alone that they registered a shape was there. To them, most people are like, well, that trial was just like the one right before it. Just like, hopefully, when you show people this gorilla video, many of them are going to be like, yeah, okay, I counted the basketballs. Now what? And many will just not see it. They were also given a form of manipulation check where they were like, okay, we did show you a shape. Out of these three shapes, please select which one you think you saw. And what they used this to test against is people were essentially guessing. And because they were guessing, you would expect that everybody would choose the shapes at about 1/3 rate for each one, because some people will choose triangles and some will choose squares and some will choose circles. And in random chance, it will be roughly equal across. And this is exactly what they found with the forced choice responses. So just going back, what happened here is someone is focused on the center of the screen. They're doing a task that's causing their attention to be somewhere else, even though they're still with their eyes focused on the center of that screen. And it is there that an image is flashed to them, and they do not see the image. It just does not register. This is, of course, different if they're told before the trial starts to expect something different on that trial. As soon as you tell them that, though, the percentage of people who miss it drops to about 10%, meaning now 90% of people see that weird shape. Just like if you were to now show half the people in your household that video without telling them anything about it, and the other half, you can tell them beforehand, okay, I want you to count the basketballs, but there's going to be something weird in this video. Chances are they will see the gorilla at a higher rate, though no guarantee that everybody will, than if you don't tell anybody about it whatsoever. This is the idea of inattentional blindness, that because we are not attending to a specific place, we are less likely to see things in that space. And as we go on, we'll also talk about how this relates to objects, and in a way, both of those two systems work in parallel. Now the question is, how does this happen, right? So it is there, the shape was shown on the screen, and you're looking straight at it. So how is it that the participant doesn't understand, well, maybe not doesn't understand, but can't tell you that they saw the shape? So one possible explanation is that people actually do see the shape, but because it's so brief and they're doing something else, they pretty much just immediately forget it right after. That the shape just never makes it into memory, and so they can't report on it. Right? This is the equivalent of, just think of all the times you've been introduced to somebody new, and by the end of the third sentence that they're speaking, you have no idea what their name was at all, even though they literally just told you their name, which is a sadly uncommon, I mean, not uncommon, a sadly common thing that happens to many, many, many of us. Yeah. Okay, so it could be that we see it, but then immediately forget, right? That's why when you ask me if anything was weird, you're like, nope, nothing was weird, because I don't remember seeing anything. Or it could be that people just don't actually even perceive the shape, right? Maybe their eyes register the light, but there's never enough signal that passes into the visual cortex for it to get any significant amount of processing, and so that shape just never even reaches the awareness threshold. You just don't ever even perceive it. And this is actually the theory put forward by Mark and Brock, who conducted this experiment and wrote this book on this form of inattentional blindness. And so here they put forward the argument that because you're just not expecting to see something right there, the feature detectors in your visual cortex and then your receptors in your eye
are differentially primed. Your large degree of priming is about specific types of lines in the periphery of your vision, because your whole task is to define which of those two lines that they're showing you are longer. That's what you're focusing on. So those receptors are going to have much higher levels of activation. And nothing exciting is happening in the middle of the screen. It's just a dot where you're keeping your eyes. It doesn't change, doesn't move, doesn't beep, none of those things. And so those receptors don't need very much activation because nothing is really exciting there. And so the question now becomes, which of these two theories is driving this lack of people's ability to see, or at least to say that they saw that shape? And I'm sure because of all these dichotomies that we've set up, and then you know how that turns out, you're probably already guessing what the right one is. But before we get into that, let's look at some real world implications of inattentional blindness. So we see this, unfortunately, a lot in daily life. It happens all the time, and the consequences of it happening are anywhere from someone laughing at you and thinking you're getting old to horrible consequences. One of the most common is with drivers who don't see cyclists or don't see stop signs. They will drive through a stop sign being like, I never saw it, or they will hit or almost hit cyclists and just never have seen them. And they'll swear that they've never seen them, and a lot of us who hear about it make judgments about them: bad drivers, shouldn't be on the road, and then all kinds of other prejudices that come up. But as you just saw, people can be induced not to see something 15 inches from their face. Not only 15 inches from their face, in a place where their eyeballs are focused, right? So there are many situations in which people just genuinely don't see these people, right? This is why it's so important for cyclists to have all kinds of flashy lights, because it's easier to pay attention to flashy lights. Another sad place where this happens a lot is when medical experts are looking at medical scans. A lot of medical scans take actually quite a bit of training, and once you've gotten training, feeling and intuition really to read them, and there can be many times where there are anomalies, right? Things like tumors or hairline fractures that people just overlook completely because they're looking for something else, right? So like, let's say someone had a scan of my ribs and they were looking at one of my left lungs. They might completely miss out the fact that two of my ribs are cracked because they're paying attention to my lungs. It's just wherever you're focusing. And that is just, it would be pretty horrible if you miss something so fundamental to your life and well-being just because someone was focused somewhere else. Now, again, this is not necessarily the case of negligence on the medical expert. This is just an unfortunate consequence of the way our perceptual system works. Now, in a more mundane sense, this is the same thing that happens when your keys are sitting on your table and you're flustered and you're looking for your keys and you can't find your keys anywhere, and you're looking at the table and you're just like, where are my keys? And then you look through all of your apartment and then you come back to your table and then there are the keys. And you're just like, how did I not see these keys? I was looking at the table for 5 minutes earlier because that's where I remembered them, but I didn't see them. Or same thing with like ketchup or mustard in your refrigerator. Almost all of us have had this experience where we're looking directly at something and just don't see it at all. Right? It's the same as when you're walking around in a public place. You can have someone who's out of context, right? It's like when I see people who I've taught in class at a bar. I mean, I hope that doesn't happen very much because it's always a little bit weird for me, but I oftentimes just don't even register that they're someone I know because I don't associate whatsoever my students being in the same place as I go to drink. Not that that really happens much in today's world, but again, one is not expecting those people to be there, and thus we tend not to even see them or register the fact that these are people we know. Now, this process gets exacerbated when we are stressed or distracted or tired, right? Oftentimes with stress and distraction, our attention is just focused somewhere completely else, and so we're not able to really truly attend to things even when they're right in front of us. And with being tired, our just entire system is slower to react, and all of these things will heighten this type of inattentional blindness. Especially with the tired, this is why long-distance drivers are often given the advice to get out of their car every 2 hours or so.
Drive, stop, get out, stretch your legs, eat a sandwich, do something else for a little while. And when you're tired, you're really tired, don't necessarily push through and drive another hour and a half, right? Just pull over and take a nap for half an hour. You are increasingly more likely to miss obvious things when you are tired and when you are driving. And it is way better to take a half an hour nap and be late than to run over a little old lady, right? You do not need that in your life. And you also might run over a cyclist, and I'm a cyclist, and I fear for my life because sometimes drivers just don't pay attention. On the upside, if this happens to you, right, like not the running over someone because that shit's just messed up. If, for example, you can't find your keys and they're right in front of you, right, or the ketchup is in the fridge, or if, like me, you've accidentally put your keys in the refrigerator, which is a little bit of a different thing, right, it's okay. You're not suffering from some type of cognitive impairment, right? You're not going crazy. Your brain is not abandoning you. It's just this is how our perceptual system works. And it is okay. Be kind to yourself. This shit happens, right? It's okay. This is why a lot of times when you're really looking for something, it can be to your benefit to just stop, shut your eyes even, and just take a few breaths and take a moment and just take stock again. And you will probably be able to find what you're looking for. Okay. Also, just as a complete side note, I don't know because I can't see all of your faces when we're talking about this, and even then it would be hard to know. A lot of people have lots of different opinions on autonomous cars, so cars that can drive themselves, right? At the end of the day, those are going to be a lot safer for most human beings, right? Whether they're drivers, pedestrians, or cyclists, than human drivers. Because a machine looking out into the world does not suffer from these same limits of attentional shift and attentional blindness like the human perceptual system does. Right? It just, at the end of the day, it will be safer. Now, that is just strictly talking about the technology itself. I am, of course, completely disregarding the fact that there will be a very serious upheaval when that technology is truly implemented across, say, this entire country. Because the long haul trucking industry, for example, supports a huge chunk of the population of this country. Not just truckers themselves, but all of the stations that are designed to cater to them, and then all of the little towns built up around those trucking institutions. And I mean, it provides economy for, I mean, probably tens of millions of Americans. Not to mention driving people around in trains, in taxis, in Ubers, all of those types of things, delivery of food service. I mean, it's pretty unbelievable, right? How much that involves or how much of our economy actually runs on this. So implementing autonomous cars will have very serious political and societal impacts. But when we're talking only about attention, at the end of the day, they will be much safer. They will not miss, barring severe tiny exceptions, little old ladies and cyclists. They will almost always see them. And they will never get tired. Right? That's just the nature of machines. Whereas we're not like that. But humans also have great difficulty letting go of control, even if a system that will replace us will do a better job. But that's just how human beings work, and that is neither here nor there. Another form of where our attention sort of not necessarily glitches out, but we can have fun games to play with this, is something called change blindness. And this refers to when one is unable to detect changes in a series of images that oftentimes go back and forth. And so one of the most common places that people, well, I actually don't know about this generation anymore, but if you look at the comic section of a newspaper, almost every time there is the game of spot the difference. And there are two pictures that look almost identical, and they will be like oftentimes six differences. And your goal is to find those differences. And it can often be pretty hard. And slowly you do better and better. On that, I mean, I would be curious to know, I'm not sure how I'm going to figure this out yet, but I'd be curious to know how many of you have actually read a newspaper. Like, no shade here or there, just thinking about how media is consumed these days. I mean, newspapers aren't that common anymore. But I don't know. We'll figure that out. Maybe I'll make some kind of poll that you can all respond to, and some trick of altruism and game and extra credit and some shit like that. But I'll send an email or something. Okay. Before I click through these images presented here, even though haha, it only looks like one, another really fun way you can see this is please go to this video link. Again, you'd have to just type this in. And just watch the video. It's a video of two women sitting at a table and they are planning a surprise party for a friend. And they are gonna, well, just watch the video and see what happens, because they will give you instructions and everything in the video itself. Now, don't worry about this note to yourself. This is just so that I didn't click past and go into the next slide too quickly and then ruin the narration. But basically what I'm going to do is alternate the pictures that are here and just focus there, please, and see if you spot the difference. And you might not. And it doesn't matter if you do or you don't. You can always rewind and keep doing this over and over. I always think people will see it all the time, but that's because I've looked at these particular images, God, hundreds of times now. So, all right. So just focus on the image, see if you can spot the difference. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. All right, that's as many as I got. Maybe you spotted it, maybe you didn't. If you did not, just go ahead and rewind it. I mean, of course, if you've read the book, then you probably already know what the error is. I mean, not error, sorry, but the difference. Nonetheless, these are very common. There are a lot of these that exist. One of the most hilarious has to do with an airplane, and there are two images of an airplane, and in one of them, the engine is missing. And it can take as many as 10 or 15 alterations before most people will register that that airplane's engine is missing. And the more in the peripheral these items tend to be, the harder and harder it is for us to recognize that some type of change happened. Okay, so a real life example of change blindness, which is just probably one of the craziest and coolest experiments that you'll ever get to see done. Here's yet another video link of actually watching it happen, because it can be so hard to believe. So the way this experiment was conducted, and this was conducted largely by the same series of people, is that you had someone on campus, an accomplice to the experimenters, and they would go up to random people and ask for directions. They'd just be like, okay, I need help finding wherever this is. And halfway between their conversation, two people who were carrying a door, right, just like a regular door that's been taken off the hinges, they're also, of course, accomplices to the experiment. They would walk right between these two people. So imagine you're getting directions from somebody else, and all of a sudden two people just come walking with a door right between the two of you. Right? How rude, huh? Which is actually something many people remembered about the situation. Now, what makes this whole thing so crazy is as these two people are walking in between them with the door, the person who asked for directions swaps out with one of the people who was carrying the door. And once the now person who originally asked for directions is just walking away now with the other person carrying the door, one of the people who was carrying the door is now standing right in front of the person they asked for directions of. And they continue the conversation as if it's the most normal thing in the world to do. So the person who's now getting directions is not the same person who asked for directions in the first place. And only about half the people actually notice that the human in front of them isn't the human they were talking to like 30 seconds ago, which is unbelievably crazy if you think about it, because most of us pride ourselves on paying attention to the world around us, right? And these people weren't twins. They didn't even look the same. They were also wearing different clothes. And this has actually been replicated tons and tons of times just because of how counterintuitive it is. I always think this is crazy whenever I hear about this, or even when I talk about it, just because it's so wild. And I can't help but wonder, what would I do in the situation? And while I'm not the best at remembering names, I've always thought of myself as pretty good at recognizing faces. But there's a toss-up of a coin that will determine whether or not I would actually remember talking to the same random person I had just met 30 seconds ago.
which is just crazy. And I mean, on another note of just wildness, think of how much the people with the door and the person who's asking for directions must have practiced to make such a clean pass off that people don't register them all like jumbling around with each other. Highly recommend watching the video. Okay, but back to which of the two theories we were talking about, because this is just a whole bunch of stuff to show you how we're not actually paying attention to nearly as much of the world as we oftentimes feel like we're paying attention to. So do these studies about inattentional blindness and change blindness, do they tell us about limits of our perception or limits of our memory? Are we just not seeing things, or do we just see things and immediately forget because we're not encoding into memory, right? Is this that we just don't see things, or do we just forget stuff right away? What is it? And in actual sort of cognitive science terms, this is captured by two hypotheses. The first is the early selection hypothesis, and this is the idea that we just don't perceive certain things, right? The selection happens very early, straight on with the perception. The late selection hypothesis is about the memory. It's we actually give relatively complete processing to everything, but then not everything actually gets encoded, because once that processing has been done, a whole bunch of stuff is relegated as irrelevant, and it's just not passed on further, which would support the memory aspect. And as you probably guessed way back when, like most things, the answer is a little bit of both. And there is evidence on both sides to show support of each of these hypotheses. So here is an experiment conducted by Hilliard, Vogel, and Luck, and this is support for the early selection, that they're processing differences. Just for extra information, Hilliard is probably one of the heavyweight giants in electrophysiological research, and is just a really cool researcher. Even though he's retired now, he actually gave a speech, not a colloquium talk for like an hour at SF State last year. And it was really great because him and all the people he's basically trained, who basically are all the people now in the electrophysiology world, Luck being one of those people who now has taken up the mantle of someone who basically trains all of the next generation. They did some pretty cool work if you're ever interested in this type of work. Okay, so the way they set up this experiment is they put a bunch of electrodes on people's heads, especially electrodes around the temporal cortex, because this is going to be an auditory-based experiment, and the temporal cortex is where you're processing a lot of your auditory information. And we put these little electrodes on because it allows us to detect electrical information around that region of the brain that is supposedly processing these types of inputs. Now, you have headphones on and you're hearing beeps on either side, and you're hearing beeps at different rates. And here are, just to point out, the pattern of beeps you can see. So here is like beep, beep, then this one beeps, then another beep on top, then two beeps close together on your left ear, another one for your right, a lot of space, two more for your left, now a couple for your right, now then two for the left, and then one more for the right. So alternating beeps, never quite at the same time. If you're really interested about these little stars on top, those are actually referring to oddball paradigm or criticals, but you don't need to get into that because you probably aren't actually doing ERP research. If you are and you want to know more, please write me an email. Okay. Here are the waveforms for the two channels. The way you read this is the 0 is a baseline. All average activity of the brain has been averaged out of this waveform. Negative is plotted up. This is a tradition from engineering because of how our positive and negative is actually thought about. Engineers tend to think of positive and negative in the other way than most conventional people do, because electricity actually flows when it is direct current from negative to positive, not positive to negative, which is how we think of most things, because we tend to think of positive as higher than negative. But electricity is one of those things that actually works the other way around. And so electrophysiologists, who basically come from the brainchild of engineering and psychology, continue that tradition. Hence, negative is up, positive is down. The way you read these graphs is regardless of whether it is positive or negative, the greater the deflection, the greater the distance from the 0 line, the greater it indicates higher levels of neuronal activity.
The more deflection, the more neurons are involved. Okay, so this red channel is for whatever ear you're paying attention to. Whether it was your left or your right, it doesn't matter. It's the one you were told to pay attention to, whichever one the experimenter is like, okay, pay attention to this ear. The blue one is the unattended channel. And here you can see that very quickly, this time scale right here is 100 milliseconds. So already before 1/10 of a second, you can see differences in processing, much more being devoted to the attended channel than the unattended channel. This gives us some support for early perceptual differences because what's happening here is one set of inputs are getting a high degree of activation, a high degree of neuronal response, whereas the other one is not getting very much activation at all. This is not nearly the same in its ability to enter our perception as this one over here. It's just a different degree of activation. Now, another bit that supports this idea of it being very early and not a memory component is the time scale on which this is happening. You can see this difference begin to appear as much as 50 milliseconds, and by 75 milliseconds or so, they're already distinctly different. At 100 milliseconds, it's a completely different ballgame. This is before our ability to become aware of an auditory stimulus, right? It takes, at fastest, about 140 milliseconds for someone to hear something and register that they heard it, for it to become in their awareness, right? It always takes a little bit longer time. Just as a fun side of how this system can be so glitchy, yet operate so marvelously, and I won't go too much into it, but you're again welcome to contact me if you want more information. Did you know that the time it takes for a pro pitcher to throw a baseball to the batsman, so the time it leaves their hand to the time it impacts the the bat, that time is shorter than the time it takes for the ball right at the instant when it's leaving the pitcher's hand, the light traveling off it, to go into your eyeballs, pass into the back of your head and get processed, and then get sent to the motor cortex to initiate the motion? This means that even though pro baseball players feel like they are swinging at the ball that's coming to them, they're not actually doing that. They are initiating their swing as the pitcher is making the throw, not after the ball has left the pitcher's hand, which is pretty unbelievable if you think about it. Okay, now we're going to talk about evidence for late selection, so the other side, the memory component. So here's an experiment done by Moore and Egath in 1997 called Perception Without Attention, and I dug up the old picture because I think it represents the slide or the trial process much better than what is represented in your book, but you can look at the picture of your book because that will be up here right there. Okay, so this task is you have a fixation, which is just a blank screen with this little plus inside, and then another screen pops up, and you'll have to look closely here most likely, but there are two lines on top of this sequence of dots. And in this critical aspect, 9% of the dots are filled in with black and the rest are white. And for the most part, they're random. And so you get this popping up and you're like, okay, the lower line was longer, the upper line was longer, the lower line was longer, and you just keep doing this. So a relatively straightforward task. But it only stays on the screen for about 200 milliseconds, which is not that long because for full degree of visual processing, it actually takes quite a bit of time. Now, right after the 200 milliseconds, there is a mask. And remember, we've talked about masks before. It's to ensure that you only have so much time to process some type of input. And the mask is just the same set of dots, but now with 30% of them mixed in a completely random fashion. And then there is a space between trials, and then the thing starts again. That's the basic structure. Now, some of these trials, where they had the two lines, the organization of the filled-in dots was not random. It was carefully crafted to set up certain types of visual illusions, sort of like this right here. So instead of the dots like this just being all over, the dots were presented such that this is the standard Mueller-Lyer illusion. right? Where this line looks longer than this line, even though they're actually the same length. And there are many illusions like this, so they had multiple trials in which this happened. So what actually happens now is people respond to which of the two lines is longer for these critical trials where the dots are giving the illusion of length to one line and not the other. Of course, in those trials, the two lines are the identical length. And people in their responses show the bias that is presented by the illusions, but they don't know that the dots were in that specific pattern because all they focused on was the lines, and they don't recall anymore that they were certain trials that had weird arrangements of dots. There just wasn't enough time for them to search all over the image and actually remember those things. And this gives evidence to the later stage of processing, that everything was processed, just not everything was remembered. Because if the brain did not process the dots and the background as much so as the lines, it should not have been subject to the visual illusion. If I had only processed the direct information and ignored or perceptually tuned out everything else, I would just register that the two lines are the same length and not have thought about it anymore. In this case, though, I am biased thinking this is longer even though it's not, and that gives the indication that I must have processed at least to some degree that these dots were organized in this shape, even though I can no longer tell you that they were arranged in a specific shape. And this lends support for the idea that we do perceive everything, just don't remember everything. And so both of these ultimately are at play together, where we are processing a lot of stuff, but not remembering. And of the stuff that we're processing everything with, not everything is receiving equal degrees of attentional resources. And then there is priming. So when we were talking about inattentional blindness and Mark and Rock's example or their explanation of why, they said that it was because people were not expecting to see a shape there. And that is ultimately what was happening. And so this can be talked about in terms of priming. Right? When you're focused on figuring out which of those two lines were longer or shorter in the peripheral of the screen, your feature detectors for the peripheral of your visual field are highly active. They have heightened levels of activation or are primed because that's where your main attention is devoted. That's what your task is. And the detectors or feature detectors for the central part of your visual screen are not very activated at all because there's nothing really going on there. And as we'll talk about with the limited capacity system in a little while, it's probably not just that those are even neutral, that those are actually being suppressed in favor of the feature detectors in the periphery. And now because of this discrepancy in activation and how easily things can reach threshold, some things can easily enter awareness and perception, and other things cannot. And as we've been talking about of things that get forgotten, things that have different amounts of attentional resources devoted to them, one way in which this process seems to happen is through what aspects of our sort of feature detectors, auditory, visual, even tactile, are primed and ready and expecting some type of stimulus to show up. Now, when I mentioned about the real-life implications with how cars can hit cyclists because they don't see cyclists, just think of if you're driving, what you're most primed to see. The most common thing you're expecting to see is other cars because other cars can hit you, and that's the worst thing that can happen. Or you could hit other cars, right? That is the most damaging situation. And so drivers are hyper-vigilant to cars, followed by pedestrians in certain situations. When people are at crosswalks, they're primed to see pedestrians. But the one group that gets through this that no one is really paying that much attention to are cyclists, especially if you grew up in a place or you still live in a place where there are not a lot of cyclists. You're just not primed to see them. And that's all the more reason why oftentimes cyclists are just not seen by drivers. All right, so two types of, let me turn this off. Okay, so two types of priming. The first we've already talked about a bunch in the last class, and this is either rehearsal or repetition priming. And this is the idea that something that you've just seen previously is more readily remembered or recognized, right? Remember when we had people look at a list of words and they learned that list of words and then they were flashed lists of words in this tachyoscopic way, that they were more likely to recognize them when they had seen them before, right? It's just the system was primed and there was activation still in the feature detectors, which made it easier to set them off again. Now, this form of priming is thought to be effortless and automatic, right? You don't actually have to do anything to engage this form of priming. It just happens naturally. And it is also what makes it so easy to hear your name at a party or in a dichotic listening test. You have heard your name so many times over the course of your life that the receptors tuned to the specific frequencies that make up your name are just with very low activation thresholds, because there's something that gets used all the time, thus it making us very sensitive to that type of stimulus. The other type of priming that we only briefly hinted at in last class at the end is expectation-based priming. And this is when we told people that we were flashing words on a screen, and we were like, okay, we're going to flash, or celery got flashed, and you had told them beforehand, oh, you know, we're going to show you something that you could eat, and that made it more likely that they would register the word celery. Right? They were expecting a certain type of thing to come, even though they had not seen the word celery before. And this is expectation-based priming. And so this can also be thought of as a way to deliberately prime a system or a set of detectors for inputs that you think are going to happen. This is like when someone is like, okay, just watch that part of the sky, you're about to see the plane come out from behind the cloud. You are now attending and priming the detectors for a very specific space, even though you might not have seen the airplane yet, so there is no rehearsal or repetition, but because you now know and expect where it will be, you just give activation to that entire region. So it can be externally cued, right, where you give someone this instruction, or it can be internally generated, right, when my goals cause me to look in certain places. Okay. Now we're going to go through an empirical example of how this works, and this has a whole bunch of moving parts, so if you need to go through this a couple times, that is okay, and I will really try and do my best to actually get all of the parts. Okay, so this was conducted by Posner and Snyder in 1975. The paper is called Facilitation and Inhibition of Processing Signals. Now, the basic structure of this trial is as follows. The participants saw a fixation. It was a plus sign, I believe, or a dot, one or the other. And after that, that's just to indicate the trial is about to start. They saw a pair of letters, right, like RR or RY, or in this case, AA or GG, or any pair of capital letters. And their task was to decide or respond, do those two letters match? So in the case of RR, you would respond yes. And in the case of RY, you would respond no. And so if you go into the original paper, half the trials in any given block, any given condition, were yes trials, they did match, and half the trials were no trials, they did not match. And these were randomly set up. Okay, so that's true for every one of these 6 lines. What I've just described is the neutral condition in both of these sets. Right? It's just nothing is different between these. They're just both presented here to show that it applies equally to the low and high validity, which we'll talk about in a second. So that is the basic structure. And then there are 4 other types of trials. Low validity primed, low validity misled, high validity primed, and high validity misled. Okay, so how does this work? A primed trial is one in which instead of the cue, instead of a little plus sign that comes to say a trial is about to start, you get a letter that pops up before the trial starts. So in this case, before GG pops up on the screen, you get a G that's like there's about to be a trial. Right? Or in the case of RR, maybe there would be an R. Now, what it means with a low validity time is that this letter, the Q letter, only came before the correct response of 2 of the same letter 20% of the time. That means every time that I was going to have 2 of the same letter and my Q letter was the same as my 2 letters, only happen 1 in 5 times, right? Which is not that many. It is the letter that comes before, but again, not so many. Misled in the low validity is not happening very common, and it is just a different letter showing up for those two. Right? So every time now GG appears, there's a 1 in 5 or like a 20% chance that after the HQ, I'm going to have 2 Gs. Right? So here the letter is priming in a repetition sense, the GG, because I see a G, my G detector is activated, and then 2 Gs follow. And I should be more ready to be able to respond to the 2 Gs because I just saw a G and my G detectors are already active. Here, there's an H that comes before, and it's not a very common preceder of the GGS trial, and so I don't really build up much expectation, and I'm not priming my GG detector because I just saw an H. So before we get into this, now we're going to look over at this first block of results. So the reason there are only 4 bars, or in this case 2 bars, and there are 3 lines here, is these 2 conditions in time are being compared to this one. That's why this is a 0. So anything above it means that they were able to respond faster. Anything below it means they responded slower than the neutral condition. Here what we can see is when they saw a G before the pair was actually Gs, they were able to respond about 30 milliseconds faster than they could respond to 2 letters being the same with just a plus sign in front of it. So just the fact that the G detector got activated is enough to increase the speed at which we recognize the 2 following Gs and can say that they are the same. When we have the H, technically it's misleading yet, but we have very low validity. It's not happening very often, so we're not building expectations. And then the GGs follow. We get about the same performance as when we are using just a neutral, because the plus sign in the A's doesn't really tell us that much. The H and the 2 Gs also doesn't really tell us that much. Okay. Now going into the high validity. Here, neutral is totally the same as it was before. Overall, this is very similar, right? I have G that shows up before 2 Gs in the prime situation. So my G detectors are primed, but what's happening here is 80% of the times I'm going to have 2 Gs and say, yep, they're the same, there's going to be a G before them. So I'm pretty sure whenever I see a G now that there are about to be 2 Gs after. Because 4 out of 5 times that I see a G, there are 2 Gs that follow. So I'm building up a pretty strong expectation that when this pops up, that's what's going to follow. We do the opposite for the H's, right? Here, you're having a high degree of an H, but it's leading to 2 Gs. So it's happening regularly, but it's not in a way that has the same detector being activated. So just like these, just this time these are 80% predictive, than these which are only 20% predictive. For high expectation and high repetition, there's a boost. In fact, this is even better than when we had just the repetition priming by itself. But now, because you're giving the opposite expectation that this should not be G's, it should be H's, right? It is causing us to take even longer because it is violating our expectation that we thought should show up, because we've gotten trained to think that it is going to be the letter that now is indicative of what the 2 letters are going to be after, but sometimes that's not the case. And in those cases, it takes us longer to respond because what's actually happening in the world is against what we expected would happen in the world. We're going to talk about limited capacity on the next slide, but this is why we believe that the system can't just do everything, because there's a cost to having an expectation that is not according to what you thought it would be. If you had unlimited resources, you could just expect everything, but we can't, And that is seen here because whenever our expectations are misled, it takes us longer to recognize things because we have primed the wrong detectors. And so now the detectors we spent all this energy priming are useless because, well, not useless, but they're not relevant here because nothing is coming to them, and we've suppressed other ones, but those are the ones receiving external activation. And then so you need to get them not just up to threshold, but you have to deal with how you suppress them earlier. And this is ultimately why it takes longer when our expectations mislead us, even though we do really well when the world is in line with our expectations. The fact that this pattern is different than this pattern is showing two different types of priming. Right? This is just repetition priming by itself. This is repetition priming with expectation priming thrown in. Okay. So as I mentioned, this indicates that we are running a limited capacity system, right? We cannot prime everything. We cannot expect everything. It's just how it is. And this is why we call it a limited capacity system in terms of our perceptual way, right? We wouldn't say this if we could prime everything, but we can't, and that's just how it goes, right? There are limits on our perception. Now, another way to think about this in daily life, like I was talking about listening to a soap opera in one ear and a sports commentator in the other while you're shadowing one, you cannot shadow both. You just can't do it. It doesn't work. There's no way to do it. Like, you can actually try and say two words at the same time, and you just can't really do it. There are limits on our system. No matter how much we might wish for superpowers, at the end of the day, they are just hard limits on how our perceptual system works. And even though that might be disheartening, there's actually a very, very big advantage to having a system like this, which we'll talk about on the last slide of this section. All right, jumping into spatial attention for a little while. Spatial attention is the mechanism through which a person allocates processing resources to a particular position in space so that they more efficiently process any inputs in that region of space. It's like if someone's sneaking up on your left side, you're going to pay attention to your left side, not your right side, right? You're devoting attention to the left, not the right. So same Posner and Snyder, along with Davidson in 1980, wrote a paper called Attention and the Detection of Signals, and in it they report a very straightforward experiment where participants are just responding to targets on the left or the right of the screen. So imagine you're pushing the left button whenever the circle pops up on the left and the right button whenever it pops up on the right. That's all you're doing. Okay? When there's just a regular fixation, this is sort of the middle task here, where people are able to push that button in about 265 to 270 milliseconds. Right? Please note that this does not go all the way to 0. That exacerbates the difference appearing of these, even though there are significant differences. If you're going to make bar graphs, please make your y-axis start at 0. It's good practice. Okay, sorry about that. It just is one of those stats things that is a pet peeve. Some trials, though, instead of just a little fixation cross or dot, there was actually a little arrow pointing in the direction of not when, but where the target was going to appear. So it would be like a little left arrow, and then it would show up on the left. And whenever it was congruent, meaning it was pointing left and it was actually on the left, people were able to respond a little bit faster, right here at about 250 milliseconds. And while 20 milliseconds might not seem like a big difference, right, in cognitive structures, it's a fairly big deal when all you're doing is pushing a button as soon as you're aware of something, right? To measure difference in that, a reliable difference, is at the end of the day a pretty big deal. When the arrow cue is pointing in the wrong direction, right, when it's telling you to focus to the left, but actually the thing shows up on the right, like sleight of hand is pretty much all about this, it takes us longer to recognize that that shape popped up, right, about 300 milliseconds this time. And this is just showing that using cues and then our attentional system, that you can pay attention not necessarily just to things, but also to spaces. What area is something going to show up in? And so all of this leads us to, well, what the heck is attention anyway? And so you're going to hear this a lot if you go into cognitive psych about this analogy of attention as a spotlight, right? It's presented here in your textbook too. And it can be, I guess, a convenient way to talk about it. Personally, I don't think it's the best way because it can be pretty misleading and it gives people these ultimately false impressions how like some people think your vision is like an eye beam and your vision is not like an eye beam. Nothing is coming out of your eyes, right? Just like you don't have a little flashlight in your mind that is pointing in different directions and that's where your attention is going. That's not actually how it works, right? Because you can pay attention to a half-eaten cookie on a table and you can just see the cookie and pay attention to the cookie and not pay attention to anything else. And how would a flashlight ever know where the edges of that cookie are? Right? Like, how would you do that? You can shine a light that covers the entire cookie so you can see it in the dark. Yeah, that's totally fine. But how would the flashlight ever make the edges? Right? Yeah, you could cut a stencil out and stick it onto the flashlight, but then as soon as you move the flashlight a little bit, that stencil no longer applies. Not to mention if you came and took another bite of the cookie, right? It doesn't quite work the same way as our attentional system. Even though our subjective experience is of our attention moving around, and that's why they talk about a flashlight, because in the dark you kind of move a flashlight around, but technically our attention isn't really moving around. That's not really how it works. And we'll talk about that on the next slide. Another common misconception that people have is that attention is related to eye movements, and that is just simply not the case. You do not have to move your eyes to change your attention. The book will talk about, and they correctly talk about, that you can shift your attention faster than you can move your eyes, right? Not even just like moving your head, but literally you can move your attention faster than your eyes. It's pretty wild. But also, think about all those times where you have been at a party or something, or in a library even, or wherever, and you're paying attention to something in front of you, right? A person you're talking to, or the book you're reading, and there's either a super attractive person or someone you care about or paying attention to, sort of in your periphery or behind you. You can pay attention to what they're saying and doing, all the while keeping your vision totally fixated on what's right in front of you. Right? And you can flexibly move your attention around in this manner. You don't actually have to use your eyes. Not to mention, you can change what you're listening to. Right? You can pay attention to some sounds over other sounds. You can also do this for your sense of touch. Right? If you know you're going to be touched in a certain place, you can focus on it. You can heighten the level of sensation you have because you're waiting and ready for a certain stimulus to happen. Right? This is also one of the reasons why if you catch a spider in your shirt, all of a sudden you feel creepy crawlies all over your body in certain parts where it could have touched you, because you're hyper vigilant now to those regions of your tactile response perceptions. Same type of thing, right? It's just you're moving your attention, and it really doesn't have anything to do with your eyes. Okay, a lot of attentional shift can actually just be explained with priming. Now, remember how we've been talking about you can prime some detectors and inhibit other detectors. And prime detectors are more likely to perceive stuff, while inhibited detectors are more likely to miss stuff. So what happens when I now switch which receptors are primed and which receptors are not, right? And again, this applies for visual, auditory, and tactile. Now, for your taste and smell, it's not quite that simple. Taste is actually pretty limited in the sense of what it has, right? It has 4 primary or 5, depending on what field you subscribe to, detectors. And then olfaction is where actually much of what we call taste actually comes from, right? It's smell response. And then you smell things, but smell doesn't let you localize in the same way as different or your other senses, right? Visually, I can take apart, there is a cup and a pen on my table. Listening, I can be like, yep, there is a guitar playing and some drums. And even with tactile, you know the difference between if I poke you with a needle and touch you with a feather at the same time. You can register that those are different things. Now, with smell, the story is actually way more complicated. While you can say there's hints of vanilla in this, and there's hints of chocolate in there, and there's hints of orange in there, technically we're smelling a very complex combination of all of those things together. And so our smell is just It's just a different type of sense. It actually even goes to a different part of the brain and bypasses the thalamus altogether. So it just is a cool, weird, super ancient sense that we have. Anyway, that's why we don't have such crazy attentional control over our olfaction, right? It's why you can't just not smell something nasty. You have to wait until you just get used to it, which is your nose molecule receptors get saturated with the stink smell. You're free to think now the fact that every time you smelled some shit, a little bit of shit has been in your nose. Sorry, it's not enough to make you sick. That's just how it works. Okay. So the way our attention shifts is when we move or change what receptors are primed and which ones are not. So if I have receptors suited to my entire visual field and I'm paying attention to something in the top left corner and I need it to move to the bottom right corner, what happens is the top right corners or top left corner, perceptual features or feature detectors are all active. I begin to suppress them, turning down their activation, and I raise the activation given to the bottom right area's feature detectors. And that change in activation across all the detectors is what I feel, my subjective sense, as my attention moving. But really all that's happening is different components are being given activation so that you're more likely to perceive things in that area. This is how our attention moves, whether it's to sounds that we're paying attention to in different frequencies, whether it's different things we're looking at in different spaces or colors, right? This is why you can look at an artwork and pay attention to the reds and then the greens and then the blues, just as you can pay attention to the squares and the rectangles and the circles, just as you can pay attention to cups and measuring tapes and watches, right? In all of those, you're not actually moving anything. All that's really happening is you're changing what types of feature detectors are more inclined to fire and thus more inclined to process what is available to them. So this is also why things that move, right, like creepy crawlies, things that blink, like lights that just like fire alarm lights at night, or just certain other blinking lights, or beeping sounds, right, phone sounds, fire alarm sounds, car alarms. The reason that they irritate us, and then they irritate us because we can't tune them out, the reason we can't tune them out is because our attentional system keeps going back to them over and over and over again. Because those types of input are actually very reminiscent of things that could be potentially dangerous. A lot of times things that move could attack you or bite you. And things that make sounds or have blinking, not so much, but blinking, we've learned that those things matter from like sirens and police and that kind of stuff. But things that make sounds also, right? And all our ancestors who ignored them didn't really make it that long. Like, remember how I've talked about if you didn't just judge that a lion could be a lion and run away instead of spending 10 minutes and looking, the person who spent 10 minutes looking isn't around anymore. They got eaten by the lion. The people who just booked it, even if it wasn't a lion sometimes, those are the people who survived. Right? This is why sometimes people make the argument that paranoia is a gene that was selected for. I've never seen any evidence for that, so we'll see how that one unfolds. Okay, for practical purposes in your real life, this is why studying with your phone on the table right next to you or notifications turned on your computer is never really going to let you keep your attention on your work. You're always going to switch. As soon as that thing beeps or blinks or flashes, you cannot help but switch your attention over briefly, to which you need to switch your attention back to what you're doing. And all of that eats up precious resources, not to mention it interrupts flow. Now, this has nothing to do with willpower, right? This is not a willpower game. You can't be like, I'm such a cool human being, I can ignore my posts on social media, or whatever is beeping about, right? It doesn't work like that. You cannot help but spend at least a fraction of a second clicking over, and then you have to click back, right? That's just how it works, right? Because remember, you're not moving anything. You're changing entire sets of neurons that are receiving activation internally and then suppressing another set of neurons that are fighting for attention, the beep, because you're like, shit, nope, not relevant. Need to go back over to this other set of neurons that I need to pump activation into. And remember, that's not a magical thing that's happening, right? That is hundreds of trillions of little salt ions that are moving in and out of electrons, that are charging them up slowly, that are initiating firing responses, that are releasing neurotransmitters that are causing this cascade. Like, it's actually no small joke that you can even switch your attention as many times as you can. But like I said, it eats up valuable resources and ruins flow. If you can just spend 15 minutes with dedicated attention on one thing, you will be much more effective than if you spend 20 minutes doing something, but 5 minutes out of that 20 is just constantly clicking around. Even though you have 15 minutes and 15 minutes doing something, you will always be more productive if you have dedicated attention devoted to something. It's just, again, how our system works. Now, you can take that as you want and live your life as you want because, right, freedom and all that jazz, but now you have knowledge of why ultimately you should put your phone far away in a drawer with the sounds turned off when you need to study, right? Just do it for an hour, play with your phone. Put it away then, study for another hour. You will be much more productive. And not just study, right? If you need to talk to your significant other, put your phone away when you're talking to your significant other, especially if it's about something serious, right? You can't pay attention to a conversation if you're constantly clicking away. Okay. The last big chunk of stuff we're going to talk about is, do we attend to spaces or objects, right? And we've kind of pretty much talked about this already, and in all seriousness, whenever I set up these dichotic questions, you probably already know that the answer is going to be somewhere in the middle, right? And that is correct here too, right? We can pay attention to stuff on our left or our right or coming from above us, right? That's, we can attend to space, and we can also pay attention to things, right? Like that misshapen cookie that's sitting on the table, right? It's just, there it is. And we don't confuse the cookie for the table. We know that it's a cookie, right? So we can pay attention to objects. One of the places that we really can study this in depth comes from people who suffer from unilateral neglect syndrome. And this is probably, to me, one of the most horrifying of all clinical disorders that can afflict someone. And it is just, it's unbelievably strange. In neglect, what seems to happen, at least in unilateral neglect, because there are some sub-branches of neglect also, is that people lose awareness of half of their visual field. For most cases, it's the left side. Very rarely it'll be the right side. People who have it on the right side actually recover much faster than people who have it on the left side. Now, this component of it being losing awareness is super important because their eyeball is fine, both eyeballs technically. Their visual processing center is also actually fine. They can process the input, they just never pay attention to it. They literally have no attentional resources for one half of their world, right? They will put on one pair of their pant leg, not the other. They'll put on one shoe, not the other. They will eat half a plate of food, not the other half. They will, even if you show them one word in the middle of a screen, they'll only read half the word, right? They won't read the whole word. If you sneak up on them from the side that they have neglect on, they won't know you're there. Even if you're standing kind of in their vision field, they just won't register. When they need to turn around and they only need to go to their left a little bit, they will turn all the way around from the right because it doesn't even occur to them that I can go left, right? To them, that world doesn't exist. It's just not there for the most part. I'm going to show you an interesting case where you can make them become aware of it, but then they pretty quickly forget. So here's another video link, or you can just type neglect patients into YouTube, and it is definitely worth seeing because it's just one of those odd things that until you really see it, it's just hard to really comprehend how that could even happen to a human being. All right. So when it comes to neglect, obviously we see evidence for spatial systems being heavily involved in attention if they've literally lost attention to an entire space, right? So that automatically shows us that attention and space are for sure connected somehow. But I already gave away the fact that it's spaces and objects. So how is it that we can look at objects as well? right? And so the way they did this is they have people with neglect look at a barbell kind of like this. And of course, they're keeping their head stationary, right? Because technically you can move their head over and they'll, of course, now see things they didn't see, but then whatever is still on the left is still gone. So they're keeping their head stable. They're able to, because they only see half, they see this red circle in which oftentimes a word or something is presented, and they don't see this blue part. Right? That just doesn't exist for them. It's not there in their awareness. And they're told, focus on this red circle. Just pay attention to this red circle as much as you could ever focus on something. And then slowly this turns. The orientation flips over. Right? So what's happening is they're paying attention to the red circle, and the red circle is slowly moving into the side of which they are not attending to, the side of which they show no awareness. And what actually happens is they can maintain their attention on this red object even as it moves into the field where they are not attending, and they can maintain attention on it. They can keep awareness of that object until you distract them, in which case, poof, it's gone. Right? Then you can start all over again. You get them now to focus on the blue one, switch it all the way around. They'll be able to follow it, and they'll keep awareness. Yep, it's right over there. And then as soon as something happens, it's gone. Again, that field doesn't exist. It's just not even there. Which is just, I mean, if you haven't, I mean, I think this, maybe you don't think this, but the brain is just so crazy. It's unbelievable. And I mean, we're still talking about perception and attention, which is already wild. We haven't even gotten to like creativity and problem solving, let alone talking about consciousness. It's just, talk about a wild system. We of course have similar findings in intact brains. We already saw spatial examples, right? When you give a cue, the target's going to be on the left, on the right. It changes how likely we are to be aware of something, right? It's basically that's spatial attention. You can get object attention by showing people two different video streams overlaid on top of each other, right? Imagine, you don't see it much anymore because like antenna streams don't get crossed for television because no one has that kind of television really anymore. But imagine you hooked up a cable and a game console to a television and were somehow spliced it together so they both showed up on the same screen, right? So you have two different things showing up. You can pay attention to things in one screen, not the other, right? Like if you had people on one and deer on the other, you can pay attention to the deer. Or if you had soccer playing on one while you were also playing a video game, you could pay attention to the soccer or the other one. It'll be distracting, but you're able to focus on one of the objects in the stream, as opposed to just getting lost between them, even though they're in the same space. So we again can see that our attentional system lets us pay attention to areas and to objects, which if you think back to how we talked about the visual cortex, does make sense because of how many unique different types of sort of processing centers we have. Lines, angles, shapes, colors, spaces, right? We kind of have attunement for all those things. Okay. And finally, we're going to talk about the advantage of a limited capacity system, right? Remember, we cannot pay attention to everything. And this actually gives us a tremendous benefit in the binding problem. So if you'll recall, feature binding is when we can take all manner of different features, red, square, angular, and merge them all together and be like a shoebox or a book, right? We can stick it all together and make a unified whole. That's what binding is. Now, this little example here, you're trying to do a various type of pop-out task. Your job is to find the red horizontal line. And it's pretty straightforward here, but imagine there were 20 of each kind, right? And only one red horizontal line. If you're just looking at everything, right? Let's say you could prime your entire system, you're not going to see the one difference. You're seeing a bunch of reds, a bunch of blacks, a bunch of verticals, and a bunch of horizontals because everything is activated. How are you going to ever know which line in particular is red and horizontal? Because you just have a ton of red and a ton of horizontals, but you'll never know which one is red and horizontal. Yet Because I have a limited system, and therefore I only focus on specific spaces and specific objects, I can cycle through each of these, and because I can focus my attention, when now I get red and horizontal activation together, because I'm only focusing on one space and one object, I can infer, at least my brain can, that what I'm looking at is a horizontal red line, and I won't confuse that with any of these other ones. This is ultimately, even though in some cases it could be nice to wish for unlimited resources in our brain, we wouldn't be able to solve a tremendous amount of daily problems if we had a way to prime all of our detectors, right? Imagine going into your closet and trying to find your pair of green pants. With all the other colors and all the other shapes, you would never be able to find them because you'd just see green and blue and red and yellow, and there would be some pants and some shirts and some dresses and some skirts and some underwear and some socks, and it would just all be together because everything would be activated, everything is firing, and remember how we talked about. One of the ways our brain knows to find things is whenever we have common or different features that are activated at the same time, we assume those go together. Right? Imagine every time you tried to find something, you actually activated your entire visual field. You would never be able to find anything because everything would always be activated and you just would not be able to function. Right? Who knew that putting limits on our own system could be so useful?